Welcome to part 3 of the endocrine system. In this one, we're going to talk about how the hormones act, hormone replacement, and we're going to cover a few hormones that actually aren't in your textbook. Here's an important one that I told you I was going to talk about. It is glucagon-like peptide 1, which is GLP-1. And they knew about this, but they didn't really think too much about it until they started doing gastric bypass on people. When you do gastric bypass, there's a number of ways of doing it. You can staple the stomach, you can put a band around the stomach, or you can literally bypass the stomach altogether. And if you do this, it forces the intestines to create this hormone, to make this hormone. So normally it makes it in small amounts, but if the stomach isn't involved, then this kicks in at a high level, and you end up making a lot of this peptide, which causes the insulin to pull the sugar out of your bloodstream. So one of the side effects of gastric bypass surgery is it instantly cures type 2 diabetes. I've put a link if you want to type in this. You can pause this presentation and go to this link. Here are the outcomes for the rest of this talk. We're going to talk about the chemical classes that the hormones belong to, and that's fairly easy. They're either water soluble or they're not. If they're not water soluble, they're generally a form of cholesterol. How the hormones are synthesized, how they are transported. We've talked about some of the organs that make the hormones, and we know that they are squirted out into the bloodstream. Some of them, though, once they get into the bloodstream, are immediately degraded. So they have to catch a ride on a protein like albumin to protect them and help transport them to where they need to go in order to cause an effect. And then we're going to talk briefly about how the hormones stimulate the target cell. So the ones that are water soluble will usually stay outside of the cell, and they land on a receptor on the cell, which causes a cascade effect throughout the cell. If it is fat soluble, it can go right into any cell in the body because all the cells are made of phospholipid bilayer, which is basically a fat. So they just go right in and they head for the nucleus. And they actually have receptors on the DNA itself. So they can turn on and off genes. So they're very powerful. Then we'll talk a little bit about how hormones affect each other when you have two or more stimulating the same target cells. So sometimes one of them will upregulate and the other one will be kind of pulling it down, so you can kind of shut it off and not get too much of an effect. But sometimes they're synergistic and they work together. And so we talk about agonist and antagonist. So if you antagonize somebody, you're against them. And if you are an agonist, you actually combine together and have an effect sometimes that's much larger than either one of the hormones would do by themselves. Then, of course, the trick is once you've done what you need to do, you need to remove the hormone from circulation. So we talked briefly in one of the other lectures about glucagon and insulin. So insulin will pull the sugar out of your bloodstream. It pulls it out, it pulls it into muscles, it pulls it into the cells that need it. But a lot of times it pulls too much out, and then you suddenly get this stab of hunger. It's like, I know I just ate, but I'm really hungry again. Or sometimes you're just sitting around, you're bored, and you just start eating. And you know that you're not hungry. You know that you don't need anything, but you just have this urge to eat. So if you reach the point where insulin has pulled too much sugar out of your bloodstream, then if you wait a little, like 10, 15 minutes, glucagon will be released and it will put the sugar back into the bloodstream and you're back to the correct level of sugar. And so the feeling of hunger will go away. People are always surprised to find out that a great number of their hormones are just forms of cholesterol, because you've been taught your whole life that cholesterol is horrible, 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 and you do not want cholesterol in your body, and you need to be tested constantly for cholesterol, and you need to take medicines that will bring your cholesterol levels down, and so on and so forth. But if you successfully do that, you won't have estrogen, testosterone, the steroid hormones, aldosterone, so you basically mess yourself up. In fact, one of the things that they found, for example, these kids, you see them out doing the balance bars and all kinds of athletic things, and they're just thin as a rail. And those kids, because they use so much of their energy, they actually don't have enough cholesterol, and a lot of them don't go through puberty. They don't go through starting having menstrual cycles. They can't get pregnant later on. So if you don't have enough cholesterol in your body, you're not going to be able to make the hormones you need to do a lot of the things such as get pregnant, have periods, develop secondary sexual characteristics if you're a guy. And the other class of water-soluble are made from amino acids. And then you have the catecholamines, which are like dopamine, epinephrine, which you and I call adrenaline, norepinephrine, melatonin, that's the one that regulates your sleep cycle, and your thyroid hormone. Now, thyroid hormone is a little different because it kind of acts as if it were a steroid, but it's not. Here's testosterone, made out of cholesterol. Here's estrogen, made out of testosterone, made out of cholesterol, which can be easily converted to testosterone. And testosterone can be converted to estrogen. And then thyroxine, this is the formula for thyroxine right here. And because it has the ring compounds, it acts a little differently than most of the other hormones that are made from monoamines. Before I forget, you don't have to do gastric bypass surgery now in order to get the GLP-1 to be secreted in the small intestines. They have a shot form that will activate it, and then they now have a pill form that will activate it. So that's kind of good news for type 2 diabetics. All right, so back to what we were talking about. The thyroid hormone can have 4 iodines or it can have 3 iodines. So they talk about T3 levels and T4 levels. So this would be the T4 because it has 4 iodines. And here's the T3. It's the same one. Here's the ring compound connected with an oxygen, but it only has 3 iodines, and it's missing the one that's right there, the 4th one. So this is T3. Besides the monoamine, which mono means one, amine, amino acid, you can have multiple amino acids, or you can have chains of amino acids. And we call these peptides. Or if it's a chain of amino acids with a form of sugar attached to it, we call it a glycoprotein. With the exception of dopamine, all of the hormones from both lobes of the pituitary, the neurohypophysis and the adenohypophysis, or the anterior and posterior pituitary, as well as the hypothalamus, are all peptides and glycoproteins. Insulin is a very large peptide hormone. Here you go. And these little things are disulfide bridges that hold it in shape. So you make these amino acids and these amino acids, and then you link them together in this configuration. And here's the love hormone, oxytocin. If you were taking a biochemistry class, then they would be talking about how to convert these different things into each other. Progesterone, hydrocortisone, aldosterone, testosterone, estrogen. Hopefully you guys all remember how messenger RNA is used to translate, transcribe. Remember those words? Translate, transcribe. So it will transcribe the messenger RNA in the ribosome using transfer RNA to make either a short peptide or a protein. Now, one of the things that you do when you're making hormones and a lot of other things in the body is you make an inactive form. So you make like pro-insulin, and then you have a hormone later on that changes it into insulin. So you have an inactive form that's made and then it's activated later. And the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus may help modify the peptide to turn it into a mature or active hormone. These structures are interesting, but you don't have to learn them. But here's proinsulin right here, and they've shown you the bits that are going to be cut away, leaving the active insulin behind. So this is proinsulin, and then after you cut this away, then you're going to end up with insulin. If you remember looking at the cross-section of the thyroid, we saw big areas where you have thyroglobulin. So this is a large protein that you've stored up in your thyroid gland. And then as you need it, you take iodine, bring it in, and attach it. So then you end up with T3, and then if you add the fourth one, then you end up with T4. And both of these are active within the body. So when the follicle cell gets the message from thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, it uses lysosomal enzymes to split this thyroglobulin and release the thyroid hormone. So again, this would be biochemistry. I want you guys to know that the thyroid is stimulated by TSH, and it releases T3 and T4. That's what I'd like for you to remember from all of this. We mentioned the three things that can turn on hormones. You can have a hormone that will turn on a hormone, like thyroid stimulating hormone. You can have a neural stimulus, so it's under the control of the nervous system. And you can have a blood-borne chemical that will also turn it on. So hormonal, something in the blood, or something from the nervous system can turn on the hormones. And you don't usually have a steady state or a steady rate of hormones. It varies from time of the day, in the middle of the night, through like a woman's monthly cycle. It's going to change, and then it drastically changes over the lifetime of a person. So children before puberty have very low levels of certain hormones or none at all, and then once they go past puberty, then they have surges in those hormones that allow them to mature, go through puberty. And then you don't need that many, so it dies back down again, and then the woman gets pregnant, and it changes the hormones. So you have different amounts at different times for different needs. A couple of examples of neural stimulus would be the sympathetic nervous system, which would stimulate the adrenal medulla to secrete adrenaline or epinephrine, and norepinephrine if you're stressed out. Another example of neural stimulation is the nerves in the birth canal that are stretched as you're giving birth to the baby, and as they stretch, they stimulate the release of oxytocin. Hormonal stimulation, we've talked about that. And then we have hormones that regulate hormones and then shut it down. So you have releasing hormones, stimulating hormones, statins. And here's a few examples of things in the blood that can change how many hormones or how much of a hormone that you secrete. So obviously we talked about glucose, and we have the glycogen and the insulin that work against each other. If you have very thin blood, you don't have a lot of protein in your blood, so that would give you a low osmolarity, then you're going to secrete aldosterone, and it's going to keep the sodium in your bloodstream. If you have the wrong calcium level, then it's going to talk to the parathyroid hormone and cause calcium to be put back into the bloodstream. Steroids and thyroid hormones are hydrophobic, which means that they don't enjoy being in water, and they prefer to be dissolved in fat. A lot of the hormones are transported by albumins and globulins. So if you are a bound hormone, if you are protected or hiding inside of an albumin molecule or inside of a globulin, then you're going to have a longer half-life. You're going to persist in the body longer, and you're going to have a longer effect. The liver has enzymes that break down hormones, but if you're bound to one of these proteins, then you escape being detected by the liver, and the albumin doesn't leave with the urine. It stays behind. And so if you're a hormone bound to one of these, then you're not peed out in the urine. So you escape kidney filtration. So once you get to the area where you need to be, then you leave the albumin or the globulin and you go in to a receptor, or if you're a steroid or thyroid hormone, you just go straight through the fat and go inside the cell. There are other binding proteins besides albumin and globulins, and you don't have to know those. Just be aware that there are a bunch of other things in your body that help protect and hide the hormones to extend the half-life. The study of receptors is fascinating. We're finding more and more about viruses that invade our bodies. For example, HIV, if it didn't have an affinity for our T lymphocytes, for the receptors on the T lymphocytes, it wouldn't be a fatal disease. But because it does like to find those, it goes in and systematically wipes out your T lymphocytes, which knocks out most of your immune system. So you end up dying of something besides AIDS. You die of pneumonia or cancer, for example. So the receptors for the coronavirus is just the common cold, but this particular coronavirus really likes to go for the ACE receptors, the ACE2 receptors in the lungs. So just the affinity for a receptor is a huge study that we're really discovering more and more things about, and we're also looking for things that can block receptors, because if you can keep the hormone, in this case hormone, from getting into a cell, or in the case of the diseases that we're seeing out there in the world, if we could keep them from going into the cells, then they couldn't reproduce. So, but we're going back and talking about hormones, and one of the things that they do, the ones that are not fat soluble, the ones that have to go to a receptor on the outside of the cell, is they have to turn on a metabolic pathway. So we'll spend a second talking about that. Target cells have anywhere from just a few up to 1,000 or more receptors for a hormone, and the hormone will go for a specific receptor. So that's what they're saying. It exhibits specificity and saturation. So you may have 1,000,000 molecules of hormone, but if you've only got 1,000 receptors, you're only going to get 1,000 hormones bound, and the rest is just overkill that you actually can't use. And since I like to go off on tangents, I'd like to speak just briefly, because I see so many people when they have a headache or something like that, and they take aspirin or Tylenol, and it clearly states on there, take 2. Do not take more than 2. And they're like, oh man, they just don't understand. Oh, I got this huge headache, so I've got to take at least 3 or 4 of them, because I need the pain relief. But you don't have receptors for more than 2. So all the other that you're taking is just putting a strain on your liver or your kidneys to excrete it. So there's always a dose on the side of a bottle that tells you how much to take, and that's what you should take because they've already calibrated it. But anyway, so now back off my hobby horse and back onto hormones. So there are specific receptors for each hormone, and once all the receptors are occupied by a hormone, we say it is saturated. In the beginning, we talked about neurotransmitters, and they act in a millisecond, just a split second. But in the case of hormones, they take a while to act. So the peptides, the catecholamines, the things that are water-soluble, the ones that cannot go through the cell membrane, they have to go onto the receptor, and then they have to start a process. So it's going to take a little while for them to do their thing. In the case of the steroids and the thyroid hormone, they can take several days because they have to go in, turn on a gene, and cause protein synthesis to occur. So remember that hormones take a while to act, anywhere from 15-20 minutes all the way up to days. It's been within my lifetime that we've actually started figuring out how some of this stuff works. And I remember the guy winning the Nobel Prize for this particular slide right here. So this is just kind of an overview. If you have a peptide hormone, and these little things are amino acids, there's a specific receptor that it fits into, and it sits there, and as it docks here, it causes this nearby membrane-bound enzyme, which they don't tell you is adenyl cyclase, to turn on. And it will take an ATP molecule, which is adenosine with 3 phosphates, adenosine triphosphate, and it'll pop 2 of them off. So now you have adenosine monophosphate. So you just have 1 phosphate left because you popped off 2 of them. And then this enzyme causes the A&P to curve around and bind to itself and make a cyclic compound. So they call it cyclic A&P. Once you've taken this ATP, altered it with an enzyme, made cyclic A&P, then this goes on and activates another enzyme and causes different effects within the cell. So you can make protein synthesis. Now, in the case of the steroid hormone, it goes directly in. It finds a hormone receptor on the DNA itself. Here's the DNA. There's the hormone receptor. There's the steroid hormone, looking a lot like cholesterol, sitting there and turning this gene on. So it is red, and you make messenger RNA, and you get protein synthesis, and you get various metabolic effects. So here are different pathways to get metabolic effects in the body. Here's another cartoon version showing you of how these various hormones work. Here's your membrane-bound receptor. Here's your phospholipid bilayer, your cell membrane. And the hormone binds. Here you go, turning on adenyl cyclase. And this one's going into a little more details. It talks about inactive protein kinases being turned on by the cyclic AMP. So now it's activated and it goes on and turns on another inactive enzyme, which then goes on and turns on other enzymes or acts on a substrate. What you're getting here is a multiplicative effect. How's that for a word? You have one hormone on one receptor. You're going to make a whole bunch of cyclic AMP, which is going to activate a whole bunch of protein kinases, which is going to activate other enzymes. So you go from one molecule to millions of effects right here. So you've multiplied your effect. So take-home message here, you have specific receptors for the water-soluble molecules that cannot go through the cell membrane. Another name for this process is called signal amplification. So we don't have a lot of hormone running around in our bloodstream. It's a very, very small amount. But even this small amount, this small stimulus, when it goes through this cascade, gives a great effect in the body. We have the ability in our body to upregulate the amount of hormone receptors that we make or downregulate, so we don't make as many hormone receptors if we don't need as much effect. One of the things that's bothered me throughout this whole COVID experience is a lot of people are taking blood pressure medicine that causes extremely high numbers of receptors to be formed for the ACE. And we're seeing some people have a dramatic effect when they get COVID, and others just have the common cold. They shake it off and they're well in a couple of days and they go on about their business. And I have not seen studies showing whether or not these medicines that people are taking for blood pressure that upregulate or cause more receptors for the ACE angiotensin converting enzyme. It just stands to reason if you have more doors open for the COVID virus, the coronavirus, to attach to and enter the cells, that you'd have a bigger effect in the body. But yet I've not heard anything about it. So maybe you guys can listen. It's truly unfortunate that a receptor that we normally have would be host to a weird virus. But unfortunately, that's what happened. All right, talking about synergistic effects, multiple hormones act together for even greater effect. And here's an example. The follicle stimulating hormone and testosterone acting together on sperm production. So one hormone enhances the target organ's response to a second later hormone. So you get your follicle stimulating hormone coming on in there, and then you get the testosterone, and you're going to make a lot more sperm. In the case of estrogen, it prepares the uterus for the action of progesterone. So you have the estrogen coming in, and then the progesterone helps maintain a pregnancy in case you get pregnant. In the case of antagonistic, the one that always comes to mind is insulin versus glycogen, because they work opposite each other. This is supposed to be glucagon. They made a little oopsie when they were typing. But anyway, this is a cartoon depiction showing sugar in your bloodstream. And if you have too much sugar, you need to pull the sugar out, put it inside of a cell. So you need insulin to do this. This is a liver cell. And you take this glucose and you daisy chain it and you make glycogen. Now, if you were a tree, we would call this starch. When you put glucoses together, it's called starch. But since it's you, we call it glycogen. And then if you don't have enough sugar in the bloodstream, you release glucagon, and glucagon takes the glycogen and pops the sugars off and puts the glucose back out into the bloodstream. So glucagon puts the sugar back in the bloodstream. Insulin takes the sugar out of the bloodstream. Most of the hormones, once you're finished with them, you don't need them anymore. The liver takes them and breaks them apart and recycles them. And the kidney takes some of them and excretes them in the bile or the urine. So you get rid of the hormones so that you don't get a continued effect. And remember, the half-life is how long it takes for half of the hormone to clear the blood, to get it out of the blood. They spend a little extra time in this book talking about stress and how we handle stress, because it has such a profound effect on your body. In fact, people who are under stress over a long period of time often end up dying. So we're going to just talk about what happens when you experience stress, the resistance to the stress, and then just exhaustion, where your body can't continue with the stress any longer. So anything that causes stress, it could be emotional. You could have some illness in your body, infection, after surgery. There's so many things. People who over-exercise, people who are just angry all the time, just type A personalities. So they're going to have elevated adrenaline, epinephrine, and they're going to have glucocorticoids. They're going to have especially hydrocortisone, cortisol, the stress hormones. In the first stages, the alarm reaction, you're going to start putting glucose back into the bloodstream. So glycogen is going to be broken down. Your body is ready for fight or flight. You're also going to increase your aldosterone. Remember, aldosterone is the one that keeps the sodium in your bloodstream. And your angiotensin levels. So angiotensin will raise your blood pressure, and aldosterone keeps the sodium and the water in your body. So you don't have to go off and get a drink in the middle of running from a bear. If the stress continues more than a few hours, your glycogen is gone. You've already broken down the glycogen that you had stored in your cells, but your brain still has to have glucose. And you can't stop what you're doing to go eat something, to replenish the glucose, because maybe you're running a marathon or you're grieving the loss of a loved one and you just don't feel like eating for several days because you're so unhappy about the death of the loved one. But your brain still has to have glucose. So you're going to have to make glucose in your body somehow. And here's where the cortisol steps in. So the hypothalamus is going to secrete corticotropin-releasing hormone. So here's a releasing hormone. This is going to go down the bloodstream to the pituitary to secrete ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And that's going to go down to the adrenal cortex, and it will secrete the cortisol and other glucocorticoids that you need, like the aldosterone. This is going to cause you to break down fat and protein, and your body has metabolic pathways to take fat and rearrange the carbon molecules, and protein, rearrange the carbon molecules, and you can build glucose from this. So you can use fatty acids, other fats in your body, amino acids, pretty much anything in your body you can convert to sugar. Cortisol has what they call a glucose-sparing effect. So it kind of shuts off protein synthesis. It says, okay, we don't really need to be making proteins right now. We really, really need to be making glucose. So all the amino acids, instead of being put together, popped together with peptide bonds to make proteins, we'll use them to make glucose. So what happens if you shut off protein synthesis? Well, you can't make antibodies, so you depress your immune function. If your immune system is shut down, you're more susceptible to infection. You can't repair places where, like, stomach acid is eating away at the stomach and the intestines, so you can develop ulcers. So a lot of people who have stress develop ulcers. That's very, very common. Your lymphoid tissues atrophy, antibody levels drop. You have poor wound healing because you're using all of your energy to make glucose, because the brain needs glucose. It can't use these other things as fuel. It's got to have glucose. People who are under extreme stress are going to usually lose weight rapidly. They start looking gaunt and sick. And if you continue with this stress where you absolutely cannot deal with the stress, then the muscle wasting, the protein breakdown, the buildup of toxic waste in your body can lead to death. So the adrenal cortex stops producing glucocorticoids. If you have too much aldosterone, you're going to have water retention and you're going to keep the sodium. But the other thing that aldosterone does is it causes you to pee out your potassium. So if you're peeing out your potassium and you're peeing out your hydrogens, then you're going to end up with alkalosis, meaning your blood becomes too alkaline and you don't have enough potassium. K is kalium. Everyone else calls it kalium. Americans call it potassium. So hypo means not enough potassium. And that will lead to death for sure. You could die from heart failure. You could die from kidney infections or septicemia, which would be your bloodstream is full of infection. So this we call the stage of exhaustion. So you need to get rid of stress. If it continues for several months, it can actually kill you. There are a few more odds and ends we need to talk about when we're dealing with the endocrine system. And one of them is we talked about the endocrine, which runs through the bloodstream. But a paracrine is a hormone that's released, or a chemical that is released, and it just acts on nearby cells. So paracrine means next to. So these are chemical messengers that diffuse short distances and stimulate nearby cells. And the classic example is histamine. Everybody knows histamine. Most of us know histamine in our nose. It causes our noses to swell up. It causes us to talk funny. Things don't taste right. We can't breathe very well. We're just miserable. But histamine is everywhere. So you have a bee sting and you get that little swollen spot from the histamine. People who are getting their COVID shots are having swelling in the area because histamine is being released in the area. In your intestines, if you have too much histamine releases in your intestines, then it causes too much fluid and you end up with diarrhea. So histamine is all over the place, but we mostly just think about it in our nose. And if you have a cold and you have histamine release, you can take an antihistamine to dry it up. But the thing is, it's also going to dry up your intestines. So people who take too much antihistamines often end up constipated because it dries out their fecal material. One of the things that is kind of neat, and they usually don't talk about it much unless you take a biochemistry class, but nitric oxide, it's a gas. It's actually a gas that's released, and it goes to nearby cells, especially the lining of your blood vessels. It's called the endothelium. So the cells on the outside of your body are called your epithelium, but the same cells that are lining the inside of your blood vessels they call endothelium. And nitric oxide can act on those cells and cause vasodilation. So it opens up your bloodstreams. I believe there's something called poppers that kids use to vasodilate, and it's just nitric oxide. Catecholamines, another paracrine, because some of them go just from the adrenal medulla to the adrenal cortex. So that's within the same gland. And then you have, besides your paracrines, you have your autocrines. So this is a hormone or a chemical that's released in a cell that acts on the same cell. So some chemicals can act as a hormone, as a paracrine, or even a neurotransmitter. I find it odd that this is in the endocrine system instead of the immune system, but here we're talking about the eicosanoids, which are paracrines, so they're going to act on nearby cells. And you take a fatty acid called arachidonic acid, and you have an enzyme. Anytime you see the word ACE, that's an enzyme. This is a lipoxygenase that converts arachidonic acid into leukotrienes, and they mediate allergic and inflammatory reactions. Now, we're looking at leukotrienes more and more as we're looking at cytokine storms and problems with people who overreact to catching COVID. Arachidonic acid can also be converted to other types of eicosanoids. Here's 3 more besides the leukotrienes that we just talked about. So prostacyclin inhibits blood clotting and vasoconstriction. Now, this sounds good because when you look at what kills a lot of people who die from COVID, they have blood clots. And so if you could convert the arachidonic acid into prostacyclin, this would stop that. That would prevent that. Another thing that is made from arachidonic acid is the thromboxanes. And after you injure yourself, so if you have damage to a blood vessel, you stick a splinter in, you're stung by a bee, there's all kinds of things that can cause damage in your body. This is going to be made by the platelets that are running around in your body. So the arachidonic acid will be taken by the platelets, converted into thromboxanes, and it will stimulate vasoconstriction and clotting. So this is probably the one that's being made in the case of people who are having problems with clotting. And then a fourth one from arachidonic acid are the prostaglandins. They were going to relax the smooth muscle in your bladder and your intestines, open up your bronchioles, your uterus. They're going to constrict or contract your blood vessels. And PGF does the opposite thing. So you have different prostaglandins doing different things. But most people, when they see the word prostaglandin, the first thing that pops in their mind is pain, because prostaglandins cause the pain that you feel when you're hurt. I'll go ahead and mention these because it's interesting. And if you're following along with all the COVID things going on and you're reading the material, you really need to know about these. But as for stuff that I'm going to test you over, I'm more interested in you learning about the pituitary and the hypothalamus, releasing hormones, stimulating hormones, things like that. So here's your phospholipid bilayer that makes up all of your cell membranes and most of your organelles. And you can convert them to arachidonic acid, but if you want to block that, you can take steroidal anti-inflammatories. And if you go on, you make the arachidonic acid, but you want to stop it before it makes the prostacyclin, the thromboxanes, or the prostaglandins, then you can take a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, such as aspirin or ibuprofen. Now, one of the interesting things, and I'll tell you this, is when you are trying to reduce pain, remember prostaglandin and pain, you're trying to block it, you can take some aspirin, and I said only take 2 aspirin. If it says on the bottle only take 2 aspirin, only take 2. But if you really are in pain, you can take 2 Tylenol at the same time because it works in a different pathway to block pain and inflammation. So you can take 2 aspirin and 2 Tylenol, but you'd never want to take 4 Tylenol or 4 aspirin because it won't work. You want to be careful about taking steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Basically, taking hydrocortisone, for example. You do not want to take that for any length of time because it will give you symptoms of Cushing's syndrome. Plus, you remember if you take cortisol too long, then it's going to knock out your immune system. So be careful with those. Only use them if it's really, really necessary. One example I can think of where you'd be taking high levels of these would be if you got into a huge patch of poison ivy to the point where it might even be closing your throat up and you're just awful, covered up with it. And then they'll give you a high level of cortisol for a day or 2, and then they'll wean you off of it. So you take a certain number the first day, less the next day, less the next day, until you finally just take 1 and then you stop. And by that time, hopefully the poison ivy will have gone away. So those are steroidal or SAIDs. And these are non-steroidal. And we talked about aspirin and ibuprofen, but Celebrex is another one that you can get from your doctor. But these are over the counter. This is what over secretion of cortisol looks like. So you definitely don't want to take the steroidal anti-inflammatories too long or allow stress to go on too long. Or in this case, I'm sure this woman has a pituitary tumor causing this. So that's what Cushing's looks like. Now we're going to spend a little time talking about what it looks like if you hyposecrete, not enough secretion, or hypersecrete. And you have a homework assignment where you're supposed to jot down the different hormones and what happens if you don't have enough or if you have too much of the different hormones. So here's an example. Somebody who's been in a car wreck, skateboarding accident, they've had some sort of head trauma. And remember, the pituitary sits in the sella turcica. It sits in a little bony pocket. So it's really well protected. But if you try hard enough, you can hurt yourself with enough head trauma to actually hurt part of the pituitary gland. And one of the things that happens occasionally is you stop being able to secrete anti-diuretic hormone. So diuretic means pee, and anti means don't pee. So if you don't have the anti-diuretic hormone, you are going to pee and pee and pee. And they call it diabetes insipidus. And I think that's an unfortunate name because anybody who sees the word diabetes immediately thinks sugar. And this has absolutely nothing to do with sugar whatsoever. It has to do with you don't have enough ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and so you just can't stop peeing. So it's called diabetes insipidus, which has nothing to do with diabetes mellitus. So diabetes mellitus is the one that does involve sugar, and that we call those type 1 and type 2 people. Sometimes your body hypersecretes. Often it's from a tumor. So there are different pituitary tumors, and they name the type of tumor by the hormone that it's making. Like a prolactinoma is a tumor of the pituitary where you're making too much prolactin, and that's a fairly common one. You can have a pheochromocytoma, which is a tumor of the adrenal medulla, and you make too much adrenaline, or epinephrine. Here's an interesting one. The toxic goiter, which is known as Graves' disease. When George Bush Sr. was president, he developed Graves' disease, and then his wife developed Graves' disease, and then their dog developed Graves' disease. And immediately the CDC rushed in, and all kinds of people were checking to see if they had been poisoned, if somebody had done something to them. Because what are the odds that the president and his wife and his dog all developed the same condition at the same time, living in the same place? And as I recall, they decided, nope, it was just a coincidence. So in the case of Graves' disease, you have autoantibodies, which means you make antibodies against yourself. But these antibodies mimic the effect of thyroid stimulating hormone. So those autoantibodies act on the thyroid and cause thyroid hypersecretion. So you're going to get a huge goiter. Another fun thing that Graves' disease does, besides make you hypersecrete thyroid hormone, is it lays down fat behind your eyes, and your eyes protrude. They stick out. So here's some pictures of people with Graves' disease. In the case of the president, they got rid of the part of the thyroid, so it couldn't over-secrete thyroid hormone. So they caught it early enough to where the fatty deposits weren't made behind the eyes. Now, how they treated his wife and the dog, I don't know. We talked earlier about hypo and hyper secretion of growth hormone. Hypo causes pituitary dwarfism. So because the pituitary is not making enough growth hormone, the individual will not grow to full height. So they'll be a dwarf. Now there are other types of dwarfism that aren't caused by growth hormone. So, and they're genetic. If you hypersecrete before you go through puberty, before your epiphyseal plates fuse in your long bones, then you're going to end up as a giant. So this is what happens if you are in childhood or an adolescent. But after your growth plates are sealed, your epiphyseal plates are sealed and no longer dividing, then you get acromegaly. And we saw some pictures of someone with acromegaly. Here's someone's hands, normal, and with acromegaly. So you don't really notice it. It kind of just creeps up on you, and your hands just get bigger and bigger, and your face gets larger and larger, and your nose and your earlobes get bigger and bigger. So it's one that doesn't get diagnosed quickly, because you don't really pay attention, and you do think, well, as I get older, I'm going to get, change. I'll look different. We talked about cretinism. If a baby is born and they're unable to secrete thyroid hormone, you must give them oral thyroid hormone. It's imperative that you do that because the brain won't develop and they will be left severely retarded. If you have, as an adult, your thyroid for some reason stops working, then they give you thyroid hormone. And it seems like half the people my age are taking thyroid hormone. This is what a goiter looks like. So here's your thyroid hormone, but swollen. And oddly enough, not making enough thyroid hormone will cause a goiter. So your thyroid just gets bigger and bigger, trying to make more and more hormone, but it can't do it. Or in the case of hypersecretion, then you have all these areas that are making thyroid hormone and they swell up like this. So you can get a goiter from not enough thyroid or too much thyroid. So if you start noticing your neck swelling like this, then the doctor needs to test your thyroid hormone. So you just take a little sample of blood and look and see how much T3 and how much T4 you have, how much thyroid stimulating hormone. If you don't make enough parathyroid hormone, remember parathyroid hormone? On the back of the thyroid gland, you've got those 4 little glands. If they take your thyroid out and don't leave behind the parathyroid region, then within a few days you're dead because you don't have enough calcium in your bloodstream. So hypoparathyroidism is fatal unless quickly corrected. If you make too much parathyroid hormone, it causes your bones to become soft because the parathyroid hormone tells your body to put calcium into the bloodstream. And if you have way too much of it, you're going to pull way too much calcium out of your bones, and so they'll become soft. You'll have way too much calcium in your bloodstream. You will get kidney stones, renal caliculi, or calculus formation. That's another name for kidney stones. Don't you think it's interesting that the word calculus has to do with stones, kidney stones, but it also has to do with a really hard math subject? They're both hard. Some other things besides the moon face that we see with Cushing's syndrome is high blood pressure, that's hypertension. You are weak because you're literally dissolving your muscles and your bones. You swell up, not just your face, but in your stomach. You have a buffalo hump on the back of your shoulders. So how they miss that, I don't know. But so many Americans are fat that have hypertension, or hypertension for sure, but are obese, that they just don't diagnose Cushing's like they ought to. But one of the giveaways is little chicken legs. You have just huge swollen face, huge swollen stomach, and then these teeny tiny little legs. And if you're fat all over. You don't have little tiny thin legs because your legs are thin because you've dissolved the muscles away. And if you don't have muscles on your legs, you're going to be very weak. So your arms and your legs aren't going to work correctly. So a lot of people go, oh, she or he is so fat and so lazy, they just sit around. Well, they need to check them for Cushing's to see if that's what's making them unable to get up. So remember, that's Cushing's. All right, another syndrome, if your adrenals are hypersecreting, and it says sometimes it accompanies Cushing, then especially if you're prepubescent, meaning you haven't gone through puberty yet, you will have enlarged external sexual organs. So in the girl, it would be her clitoris, and the guy, it would be his penis. And you have an early onset of puberty. So we're seeing a lot of this anyway, which is really amazing. If you teach elementary school, you sometimes have kids as young as 6 or 8 years old that are already having their periods. So that's obviously not okay. And if you're hypersecreting it from birth, you can actually, girls will have such an enlarged clitoris that it actually looks like a penis, and they think that they've got a boy baby. You know, when you change the diaper and you're like, oh yeah, this is a boy. It's like, no, that's a girl with masculinized genitalia. As you're older, if you've gone through puberty, you're older, and now you're hypersecreting. This is where you see girls that have beards. They grow more body hair, and their voice gets much deeper. So it is a masculine, I can't say that word, masculinizing effect. Makes you look more masculine, more like a boy. And then the number one metabolic disease in the entire world is diabetes. So you know you have diabetes when you are always hungry, you are always thirsty, and you pee like a racehorse. That's an inelegant way of putting it. So most people pee maybe 1 to 2 liters a day, and somebody who has diabetes can pee many, many liters more than that. It's easily detected. You can pee on a stick. They have the little sticks you can pee on, and it'll light up if you are peeing out sugar, because you should not pass glucose in your urine. Your body should take back the glucose and put it back into your plasma so that you can carry it to the brain and the other places that need it. But in the case of a diabetic, they have so much glucose that the kidneys are overwhelmed and they just can't pull all the sugar back in, and so you're peeing it out. You'll also have ketones in the urine, and if you have too much sugar, then you're going to have more water going out with the sugar. So if you remember how osmosis works, you'll understand that. And then when we study the kidneys, we will definitely talk about how glucose affects the thickness, the density of your urine, and how much water that you put out of your kidneys along with the urine. In the case of type 1 diabetes, you have to have insulin. That is always used. But whether you inject it, whether you have an insulin pump that delivers a certain amount, or I've never seen this before. I know a lot of type 1 diabetics, and I've never seen any of them that inhale the insulin. But anyway, that's apparently the man writing this book has seen this. You constantly have to monitor your blood glucose levels. So if you go too low, you've got to eat something to put the sugar back into your bloodstream. And if you have too much, you're going to have all sorts of problems. You can go blind. You can lose your arms, your legs. Usually your legs go. You'll have sores that won't heal. So there's all kinds of complications for untreated type 1 diabetes. And I have concern that the price of insulin has skyrocketed lately to where a lot of people actually can't afford insulin. So we're seeing people dying. One of my friends died of type 1 diabetes because she didn't get her insulin. So I really am concerned about that and why they suddenly jack the price up out of people's price range. If you have somebody in your family that's type 1 diabetes, then you have the possibility that you also have the gene. So there is a hereditary susceptibility. Now, interestingly enough, you don't just suddenly get it. Usually what happens is you catch the flu, and then as you're healing from the flu, you attack the beta cells in your pancreas and you destroy the cells that know how to make insulin. So if you can find someone who has a susceptibility, who is genetically predisposed to having type 1 diabetes, and make sure that they get the vaccination against the type of flu that triggers type 1 diabetes, then they should never develop it. So they've got the gene, but they don't turn it on. So they don't develop type 1 diabetes. In the case of my girlfriend who passed away, she didn't develop type 1 diabetes until she was 46. They usually call it juvenile onset diabetes because kids, they go to school and they catch whatever's going around through the school, and eventually they catch the flu that triggers the autoimmune response where they destroy their own beta cells in their pancreas. So we need to be looking very carefully at people who have type 1 diabetes and make sure their children are immunized against anything that might trigger their diabetes. So they said that also, besides the flu, measles and a cytomegalovirus can also trigger it. So it destroys the beta cells in your pancreas. So 5 to 10% of the cases of diabetes are type 1, but most people have type 2 diabetes. If you catch type 2 diabetes early enough, you can treat it with just weight loss and exercise. Because the problem is you're still making insulin. There's nothing wrong with your beta cells, but the target cells aren't responding to the insulin and they're not pulling the sugar out of your bloodstream. So you don't have enough receptors, or they're defective, or something's going on, but the target cells are not accepting the insulin and they're not pulling the sugar out of the bloodstream. So they say that if you lose weight, or if you have so much fat that the hormones coming out of your fat are overriding the insulin, if you can lose weight, then you'll have enough insulin receptors that you can take up the glucose. But if you can't lose weight for some reason, you don't exercise, then you're probably going to start out taking oral medications. Metformin seems to be the one that they give everybody to start out with. And it should pull the sugar out of your bloodstream. The problem with people who are grossly overweight is you pull the sugar out of the bloodstream, and then during the night, all the sugar is re-released into the bloodstream. So that sometimes doesn't work. So if the oral medications that are out there, there's a whole host of them. There's injections, there's all sorts of things that you can do to try and stop type 2 diabetes. But if that doesn't work, then those people will have to use insulin. They'll actually have to take insulin shots, just like a type 1 diabetic, because they've got to pull some of the sugar out of the bloodstream. You can't have really high levels at all the time. Most of you have gone to the doctor and they shine the really bright light in your eyes. They're actually looking at the back of your eye. They're looking at the retina of your eye. And if you have diabetes, you're going to grow extra blood vessels. So your vision is going to go. You're going to have bleeding in the back of your eye. So these are the eyes of somebody who have diabetes, and they have abnormal blood vessels growing in their eye. People looked at the pathology of people who have type 2 diabetes, and they looked to see them developing ketoacidosis, And they said, oh, look at this. Wow, you lose weight and you burn fat. Wow, this is a good thing. Let's make a keto diet. And so we can throw people into ketosis. What a good idea. Unless, like some people who have type 1 and type 2 diabetes, you end up with deep gasping, breathing, and slip into a diabetic coma, and terminal means die. So why in the world somebody would deliberately throw themselves into a near fatal condition to lose weight is beyond me. If you do not get that sugar out of your bloodstream, besides causing extra blood vessels to grow in your eye and causing you to go blind, you can also develop neuropathy, where you lose the feeling in your digits, especially your toes. So you end up hurting your toes and you don't even realize you did, and you'll have sores on your feet, and then you end up losing your feet and losing your legs. You get atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is a blockage of your arteries, and so then you end up with heart failure, kidney failure. Oh, other fun things. Erectile dysfunction means you can't get an erection, so you can't have sex anymore, and you can't keep the muscles that hold the urine back, so you're constantly dribbling on yourself. So a lot of reasons why you want to get your blood sugar down. So we're done with this. The takeaway messages: there is a lot of complexity to the endocrine system, but it is so incredibly important because it controls your metabolism. It is what maintains your homeostasis in your body. So it is a good idea to learn about it and even advocate for yourself when you go to the doctor's office and say, hey, would you mind running a thyroid panel to see if my thyroid's working correctly? Or, you know, we need to look at my A1C and my glucose levels. So you can suggest things that you think that you might need done in case your doctor forgets to order them. So I hope you enjoy the endocrine system and are not intimidated by all of the new terms and things that you had to learn.